Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take these complex, sprawling stories and, well, we try to extract the most compelling insights.
Exactly.
Today, we are tracing a mystery that it spans 40 years. It starts in the chaotic post-counterculture 1980s and goes right up to the algorithmic precision of the 2020s.
It's an incredible arc.
It really is. And this isn't just a cold case. It's more like a detailed, longitudinal study of how American crime is investigated and, the bureaucratic hurdles that can stop justice cold.
But also the scientific miracles that can resurrect the anonymous dead. The contrast is just stunning.
We are talking about the tragic and ultimately the miraculous story of Harold Dean Clouse, Tina Gail Lynn Clouse, and their daughter, Holly Marie.
It's a case that really forces us to look beyond the sensational headlines,
Yeah.
and to focus on the mechanics of failure and then the eventual success.
Right.
So our mission in this deep dive is to trace that timeline and trace it precisely. We're going from the moment the Clouse family vanished in October 1980 all the way to the incredible recovery of Holly in 2022.
And to do that, we have to meticulously identify those points of systemic failure, right?
Yes, especially in that pre-digital era. We have to look at the bureaucratic decisions that just dismissed this case and then, contrast them with the revolutionary success of forensic genetic genealogy that finally gave the families the truth.
And before we even get into the disappearance itself, I think we have to zoom out a little bit. We have to set the sociological scene of the early 1980s.
Absolutely.
Because when we look at Dean and Tina Clouse, we see this perfect storm of economic drive, spiritual yearning, and the vulnerability that comes with all of that.
You have to understand the drivers of the time. It's crucial. The U.S. economy was undergoing this massive reorientation.
The Rust Belt was declining.
The Rust Belt was stagnating, but across the Sun Belt, places like Texas, Arizona, Florida, they were just experiencing these immense construction and population booms.
So that created this mass migration of workers.
It did. Young, skilled workers, families chasing work, they were leaving these established communities and becoming, for lack of a better word, newcomers in places where they had no local history, no roots.
And Dean Clouse was a skilled carpenter, which would have made him incredibly valuable to that boom.
Precisely. He was sought after. The housing market in Texas was red hot, especially around Dallas-Fort Worth. So they made the move from Florida.
And in doing that, they left behind the only support structure they really had.
The only one. Dean's mother, Donna Casasanta, Tina's siblings, they were all back in Florida. So they settled in Lewisville, Texas in the summer of 1980. Now, this move was economically very sound, but sociologically, in terms of safety nets, it was a disaster.
I mean, when you're transient like that, your life becomes portable. And when your life is portable, your sudden absence is just terrifyingly easy to rationalize away.
That's it, exactly.
You're just another family that packed up and moved on to the next job site.
That is the vulnerability. They lacked the deep community roots that might have prompted, local Texas authorities to file a missing persons report quickly. And then compounding this economic transience was the spiritual chaos of the era.
Right. The 60s and 70s had seen the rise of the Jesus People movement.
And by 1980, that movement had fractured. It splintered into these, some of them evolved into what we now recognize as high-control groups or, cults.
And these groups preyed on that idealism.
They preyed on the idealism, the spiritual searching, and, crucially, that economic isolation. They offered community, a clear purpose, a ready-made support system in a world that felt, I think to a lot of people, increasingly disconnected and unstable.
And the sources describe the Clouses as deeply spiritual, maybe a bit naive.
Which unfortunately made them prime targets for a group that was offering this radical, immediate form of spiritual salvation.
That's such a chilling combination, isn't it? Economic pragmatism, just moving for a better job, leading them right into this dangerous spiritual movement.
And ultimately, right into the intersection of radicalism and murder.
Wow.
And that leads us directly to the moment the silence started. Their isolation meant that when they stopped their consistent letter writing in October 1980, the alarm bells were only ringing for Dean's mother and Tina's siblings.
Hundreds of miles away in Florida.
Hundreds of miles away, with no real way to confirm what was happening across state lines. And the difficulty of verifying a crisis back then, with long-distance landlines and slow mail, it just bought the perpetrators crucial time.
Okay, let's move to the family profile and the vanishing itself, because it happened with just alarming speed. Harold Dean Clouse Jr., he was 21.
Just a kid.
And Tina Gale Lynn was only 17 when she married him in 1979. I mean, they were just kids trying to start a life. And their daughter, Holly Marie, was born in early 1980.
They were really striving for that American dream. They were using Dean's skills to buy a car, that 1978 Burgundy AMC Concord, which becomes important, and establish themselves.
But once that contact just abruptly ceased in October, the family in Florida, they were immediately suspicious.
They were. They tried to contact Dean and Tina for weeks without any success. And this is where the orchestrators of the murder executed their masterstroke of deception. It was designed specifically to paralyze the only people who were actually looking for them.
And this deception, it wasn't just a simple lie, it was a performance, right? It was designed to exploit these cultural blind spots and sort of institutional fears.
It was chillingly effective. We know that in late 1980 or early 1981, around the exact time the Clouses were likely murdered, 3 women, and this detail is key, dressed in distinctive all-white religious robes, they arrive at the home of Dean's mother, Donna Casasanta, in Daytona Beach, Florida.
And the thing that sold the lie, the thing that made it so believable, was that they showed up driving the family's car.
The AMC Concord. That detail is absolutely essential. The car was a major asset, and it was physically present. One of the women, who identified herself only as Sister Susan, delivered this perfectly constructed narrative.
Which was,
She said Dean and Tina had joined their group, implying it was the Christ family, that they had renounced all worldly possessions, and that they no longer wished to have any contact with their earthly or biological families.
okay, let's really unpack this. Let's analyze how this specific act just paralyzed law enforcement and created this 40-year cold case. Because this is where the bureaucratic failure is just laid bare.
This is the crux of the institutional failure. It was a multi-layered attack against the 1980s system. First, the car.
Right.
Returning a valuable asset like that implied it was a voluntary transfer of ownership. It immediately alleviated any suspicion of a violent robbery.
So the police start treating it as a civil dispute, not a criminal matter.
Exactly. And second, there was the religious aspect. The white robes, the talk of renunciation.
That invoked First Amendment protections, I imagine.
Absolutely. And the cultural familiarity of that post-hippie commune-style spiritual movement. Police departments back then were extremely hesitant to tread on what appeared to be a legitimate religious choice, however radical it seemed.
So they didn't want the potential lawsuit.
They didn't want the lawsuit or the headache of investigating a group that could just claim spiritual persecution. So essentially, the police told Dean's mother that Dean and Tina, as adults, had the right to make a lifestyle choice and, disappear.
And they classified it as a voluntary disappearance.
They did. They closed the file. And this seemingly small bureaucratic decision had just enormous, catastrophic consequences for the investigation's future.
Let's get specific on that consequence. We're talking about the difference between a local record and the NCIC database.
This is such a critical distinction, and it needs to be crystal clear. If a missing persons case is deemed voluntary, it is generally not entered into the FBI's National Crime Information Center, the NCIC database.
And the NCIC is the big one. It's the National Cross-Jurisdictional Database.
It's the one that matters. It holds records on missing persons, wanted individuals, stolen property. If Dean and Tina's information, their names, dates of birth, any dental records, had been entered into NCIC, any police department in the country that found unidentified remains would have run those details and gotten a hit.
But because Florida closed the case, the NCIC was silent on them.
It was completely silent. So just a few weeks later, when their bodies are found in Texas, the Texas authorities would search their local databases and maybe NCIC for active cases.
But there was nothing to find.
Nothing. Finding 2 unidentified bodies labeled John and Jane Doe did not trigger a match to an open missing persons case in Florida because that case was administratively closed. It was excluded from the system.
So the missing persons report and the unidentified bodies, they existed in these completely separate, impermeable silos.
For 4 decades, they were administratively erased before the investigation even had a chance to begin. It's just this is a structural failure of the highest order.
So while the family is grappling with this story of a spiritual conversion in Florida, a completely different, gruesome scene is unfolding in Texas.
That's right.
This takes us to the discovery of the Harris County Does and that forensic wall that immediately just obscured their identities.
The timeline is just chillingly synchronized.
Yeah.
On January 12, 1981, off Wallaceville Road in a wooded, pretty isolated part of Harris County, Texas.
A few hundred miles from where they've been living in Louisville.
Right. A man's dog returned home with a piece of, what the owner recognized immediately was a human hand.
Oh.
So searchers followed the dog's path about 100 feet off the road, and there they found the decomposing remains of a young man and a young woman.
The post-mortem interval, the PMI, must have been crucial here, the estimate of time of death.
It was critical. In 1981, this was determined through forensic anthropology. You're looking at the stage of decomposition, evidence of scavenging, environmental factors like temperature.
Sure.
And the analysis placed the time of death sometime in December 1980 or very early January 1981.
Which overlaps almost perfectly with the Sister Susan visit.
Almost perfectly. The family was being lied to while their bodies were decomposing in a ditch.
Let's detail the violence, because the autopsy provided these crucial, albeit insufficient, clues about the dynamic of the attack. Dean and Tina were killed using distinctly different methods.
And this contrast is highly suggestive of the perpetrator's motives. The John Doe, who we now know was Dean Clouse, had been bound and gagged.
Okay.
His cause of death was homicide by severe blunt force trauma, a brutal beating. It suggests a deliberate, sustained attack.
And the fact that he was restrained.
That suggests he was incapacitated, possibly subdued for, I don't know, interrogation or maybe forced to witness events before his death. It really speaks of dominance and punishment.
And the Jane Doe, Tina Clouse, she was strangled.
Correct. And strangulation is often classified by forensic experts as a much more intimate, up-close form of violence. It requires sustained effort and control.
And she wasn't bound.
The initial reports suggest she was not. And this opens up this very unsettling speculation. And it is speculation, but it's based on the evidence. That Dean may have been forced to witness his wife's murder as an ultimate act of torture or control before he, too, was killed.
But the crucial omission at the scene, the piece of evidence that Texas investigators didn't even know they were missing, was Holly.
Precisely. No infant remains were found. And because the Texas investigators had no NCIC entry telling them they were looking for a couple with a baby, they processed the scene strictly as a double homicide.
So they collected what they saw.
They collected a bloodied towel and a pair of gym shorts, which they logged as evidence, but without the context of the Florida Missing Persons report, they couldn't interpret those items as potentially relating to a kidnapping. They were looking for a killer, not a baby.
So this brings us back to those three massive failures that just cemented their identity as cold case victims for 40 years.
Right. Failure number 1, lack of local roots. Dean and Tina were transients. They didn't have local dental records, local friends, or employers who would raise the alarm in Texas.
The people who missed them were far away.
And their local alarm had been systematically shut down by bureaucracy.
Okay, failure number 2.
Forensic limitations of 1981. This was the Stone Age of forensic science. There was no DNA profiling available for identification. ID relied solely on fingerprints, which they didn't have on file or dental records, which are useless unless you have a name to compare them against. And decomposition made visual identification impossible. They were, structurally unidentifiable.
And failure number 3, which seems like the most important bureaucratic oversight.
It is jurisdictional silos. Because the Daytona Beach PD had closed the case as voluntary disappearance, the key details, Dean and Tina's names, ages, their dental information, it never made it into the centralized NCIC database.
So the one report that did exist, the private one from the Salvation Army,
completely invisible to the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office. The necessary human interaction to connect the dots was just systematically blocked by administrative procedure.
the result was total anonymity. I know forensic artist Mary Mize created reconstructions, but no leads ever materialized.
None. Dean and Tina were interred in the Harris County Cemetery, and their graves were marked only by case numbers. Anonymity was their fate for the next generation. It's heartbreaking.
30 years pass. 30 years. The case just sits dormant. It gets reviewed periodically, I'm sure, but it's stalled because they can't put names to the faces.
Right.
And the media narrative, it shifted entirely. It was all stranger abductions and the satanic panic, leaving the Clouse case, which involved someone walking away with a group, utterly forgotten. But then the technological leapfrogging begins.
It did. For 3 decades, the physical evidence, their bones, sat in the Harris County storage facility. The first crucial attempt to break that forensic wall came in 2011, a full 30 years later.
And this was led by Dr. Jennifer Love.
Yes, the director of forensic anthropology, she authorized the exhumation of the Harris County does.
So what was the primary scientific goal of that 2011 exhumation, now that DNA technology was viable?
Well, The initial objective was pretty basic, just to extract viable DNA, not necessarily for identification against a public database, which wasn't really a common thing yet.
Right.
It was just to determine if the male and female victims were related, were they spouses, siblings, something that would help refine the search parameters.
And they were successful. They got genetic material.
They were. It was retrieved, preserved, and profiled, but this led to a very short-lived dead end.
Right, because they put the profiles into CODIS.
They did, and this is where we have to distinguish between CODIS and NCIC again. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, is a closed system.
For criminals.
It's a national database holding DNA profiles of convicted offenders, arrestees, and unsolved crime scene evidence. Dean and Tina Clouse were not criminals. They had clean records.
So no match.
No match. The case went cold again, and it perfectly illustrates the fundamental limitation of traditional forensic databases. They only work if your victim or suspect is already in the system.
And this is where the real revolution happens. We move past the limitations of CODIS and into the wild, innovative world of forensic genetic genealogy, or FGG. This is where the impossible suddenly becomes possible.
FGG is a complete game changer because it breaks that closed system. The technique involves taking the forensic profile, the DNA profile retrieved from the bones, and uploading it to public genealogy sites like GEDmatch or FTDNA.
But only the ones where users have voluntarily opted in to allow law enforcement matching, right?
That's a critical point, yes. And instead of needing a direct family match, FGG only needs distant matches. Third, fourth, or even fifth cousins.
And once they have those distant cousins, the genealogists start this meticulous work of building what's called a reverse family tree.
It is painstaking historical work. I mean, they start with the distant matches. They trace those matches' ancestry backward through birth records, marriage records, obituaries, census data, all publicly available records.
And they're looking for a common ancestor.
A common ancestral couple. And once they find that couple, they trace forward down other branches of that couple's tree, looking for missing persons who fit the victim's profile and timeline. It's like building this huge map until the nameless victim's identity just snaps into place.
Now, this kind of research is not cheap. And the funding model for the Clouse case is a fascinating modern development. It wasn't taxpayer funded.
No, it relied on private funding, which is becoming more and more common in these complex, cold cases. The cost of the FGG lab work and the genealogist's time was underwritten by AudioChuck.
The company behind the podcast, Crime Junkie.
Exactly. And this highlights a real paradigm shift. You have media entities now financing the expensive technological steps needed to break cold cases that municipal or county budgets simply can't cover. It's a completely new partnership between media, science, and law enforcement.
So the case was taken on by the genealogical team at Identifinders International, led by Misty Gillis and Allison Peacock. How did they actually do it? How did they crack the identification?
Well, Gillis focused first on the male victim, the John Doe Dean. She uploaded his profile to GEDmatch, and the initial distant matches pointed very strongly to one region,
Kentucky.
concentrated mostly in Kentucky. This gave her the starting point, and she spent 10 days, which is an incredibly compressed and focused period of time tracing the lineage backward and then forward through those Kentucky connections.
And that led her to the Clouse family?
It led her right to the Clouse family. Specifically, she identified Dean's mother, Donna, and his sister, Debbie Brooks.
And then comes the moment that requires just extreme emotional delicacy, contacting Debbie Brooks.
Oh, immense sensitivity. They couldn't just call a stranger and say, your brother is dead. The sources really emphasize how the genealogist had to approach it indirectly.
So they asked something like, do you have a relative who went missing?
Exactly. Do you have a relative who went missing around 1980 who might match this profile? And when Brooks confirmed, yes, my brother Dean, the identification of John Doe was finally confirmed through an official DNA comparison with Dean's mother, Donna.
But the true pivot point of the entire 40-year investigation came not from the scientists, but from Debbie Brooks's immediate reaction to the news about her brother.
This is the single most important detail of the identification phase. I mean, the investigators had found Dean, they were ready to move on, find his killer. But Brooks immediately asked the question that unlocked everything. She said, what about his wife and daughter?
And that question just instantly shattered the investigative paradigm.
Completely.
Texas thought they were dealing with a double homicide. Florida had deemed it a voluntary disappearance. Now suddenly they're dealing with an active kidnapping.
A 40-year-old act of kidnapping. Allison Peacock immediately pivoted to the female victim's DNA and confirmed her identity as Tina Gale Clouse. But the knowledge that a baby, Holly Marie, was missing and was not found at the scene, it just changed everything. The Harris County does have their names back, but the search for baby Holly was just beginning.
Which brings us to this active investigation, the baby doe crisis. Identifying the parents immediately created a new and, frankly, terrifying mystery. Where was the infant?
The task force, which was now a multi-agency effort, had to immediately weigh the possibilities. There was the grim theory that Holly was killed and her tiny remains were scattered by animals, or, decomposition just made retrieval impossible.
Oh, the hopeful theory.
The hopeful theory that she was abducted by the killers. And given the initial account of the family joining a cult, and the cult being the likely perpetrator, the abduction theory gained immediate traction. It provided the first real thread of hope in 4 decades.
So the task force mobilized quickly. What agencies came together to launch this Hope for Holly project?
This required massive cooperation. You had the Texas Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, Louisville PD, the Volusia County Sheriff's Office in Florida to revisit that original deception, and critically, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC.
And they're the ones who did the age progression images.
Yes, they created images estimating what Holly would look like at age 42. They knew the window was small. They needed her, or someone who knew her, to recognize the family resemblance before that trail completely died.
Okay, let's do the deep dive now into the Christ family cult. This is the root of the motive and the just bizarre circumstance of Holly's survival. We need to move past the high-level points and really get into the specific pathology of this group.
The Crace family was not a mainstream religious group. It was a radical, fringe, high-control offshoot of that post-60s spiritual movement. It was led by Charles Franklin McHugh, who had this bizarre moniker, Lightning Amen.
Right.
And to understand why they murdered the parents and took the baby, you have to understand their worldview.
So what were the specific tenets that made them so uniquely dangerous?
We can break it down. First, nomadism. They rejected all permanent housing and community ties. They were constantly traveling, moving between Texas, Arizona, California.
So this lifestyle was their defense mechanism.
It was explicitly their defense mechanism. It was designed to evade scrutiny, law enforcement, tracking. If you commit a murder in Texas, you're 500 miles away in Arizona a week later with no address to trace. They were the perfect transient murder suspects.
And then the visual aspects of asceticism. The white robes, walking barefoot, renouncing goods.
That was their uniform. They rejected modern comforts, adhered to strict vegetarianism, and refused to wear anything made of animal product like leather.
And the white robes, which Sister Susan wore, they served a dual purpose. They made them distinct and memorable, this striking vision of spiritual purity, but simultaneously anonymous.
A mask.
A mask. All sisters looked alike, dressed in white, offering a level of organizational anonymity.
Third, renunciation. This is where they demanded that initiates cut ties with their biological family. Yes, they viewed biological family relationships as sources of spiritual corruption and distraction. And this doctrine, it explains the entire deception plan perfectly. The lie told to Donna Casasanta that Dean and Tina had renounced their families was central to their belief system. It made it terrifyingly believable to a 1980s police officer who was dealing with a counterculture group.
And finally, the doctrine that is so critical to Holly's fate. Anti-family ideology.
This is the critical insight into why that parents were killed and the baby was spared. The group viewed the nuclear family unit, the love between parents and a child, as an idol that distracted followers from devotion to lightning amen and to God.
And they called children excess baggage.
The sources say children were often referred to as excess baggage or impediments to the group's rigorous nomadic lifestyle.
So if the baby was just excess baggage, that explains this horrifying paradox. They murdered the parents, but they offloaded the baby instead of killing her.
Precisely. The abandonment happened quickly in November 1980, right after the murders. And we know the details because they were recorded in the adoption records.
So what happened?
3 women in white robes arrived at the office of a Seventh-day Adventist church in Yuma, Arizona. They approached the pastor, a man named Philip McGoldrick, and they simply handed the baby, Holly, over.
And what did they say? What was the justification?
The dialogue was crucial. They framed it spiritually. They claimed they were fulfilling a spiritual duty, that they were gifting the child to God. For them, killing Holly would have been a sin or maybe just an unnecessary exertion. Abandoning her at a church was a logistic solution framed in religious terms.
So they were just ridding themselves of an impediment.
While performing what they viewed as an act of divine service. It's a twisted logic.
And the pastor, McGoldrick, he recognized this as abandonment and contacted the authorities.
Yes, thankfully. Pastor McGoldrick acted ethically. He made sure the baby was safe and entered the system, which is what created the paper trail that ended up saving Holly 40 years later.
And we know some of the names of the people involved.
We know Sister Susan, who drove the car back, and possibly a woman identified as Rosemary Garcia, who may have been one of the women who handled the abandonment. They both remain key persons of interest.
Let's go back to the motive for the murders themselves. While theft of the car was a factor, the consensus really points strongly to this conflict theory that Dean and Tina tried to leave.
That is the most highly plausible theory, and it's based on the cult's pathology. They were likely attracted by the spiritual promise, but the reality of the harsh asceticism, the constant travel, and, most critically, the demand to surrender their baby. That must have broken the camel's back.
They realized they'd made a terrible mistake.
They realized it and tried to leave the group, taking Holly with them.
And in high-control groups like this, trying to leave is seen as the ultimate betrayal and is usually met with swift and brutal violence.
It's met with a punitive response. The extreme violence used, the severe beating of Dean, the binding and gagging, it suggests intense rage, punishment, or prolonged struggle when he attempted to retrieve his family.
And Tina's strangulation.
It suggests silencing a threat, or silencing someone highly resistant to the demand to abandon her child. The sequence of events strongly suggests the murder was an execution following a confrontation over their continued involvement or, specifically, over the fate of Holly.
So the cult needed their possessions.
But they needed the Clouses permanently silenced to maintain the group's control and its secrecy.
All right, part 5. The recovery, reunion, and the continuing justice. 40 years later, the breakthrough in finding Holly came not from more cutting-edge DNA science, but from good old-fashioned detective work.
Yes, following the cult lead that was generated by the FGG, that's often how these complex cases get solved. A high-tech breakthrough gives you the victim's identity, which then provides the crucial human context, the motive, the killer's likely path, which then leads back to traditional police work.
So the cult connection gave investigators a clear geographical roadmap: Texas to Arizona.
Exactly. So they zeroed in on the Yuma, Arizona region, and they were searching for records dating back to November 1980 that would document an abandoned infant.
So they were scouring everything.
Everything. Adoption agencies, hospitals, and, crucially, church records. And this painstaking search eventually led them to the sealed adoption records in Yuma, which detailed an infant girl abandoned at a Seventh-day Adventist church. The details, the timeline, the baby's age, the circumstances, it all aligned perfectly with Holly's disappearance.
And then the incredible moment of the recovery, June 7, 2022. It happened on what would have been Dean Clouse's 63rd birthday.
Just a profound convergence of fate. Investigators located Holly Miller, now 42, living a stable life in Oklahoma, a mother of 5. And the communication strategy for this reveal was just meticulously planned. They understood that dropping this truth bomb could be psychologically devastating.
You can't just call and ask for a DNA sample.
No. They had to prepare her for the traumatic reality. And the crucial framing, which law enforcement often cites, was, your parents didn't leave you. They were murdered, and we've been looking for you for 40 years.
And that framing is a humanitarian masterstroke, isn't it?
It is. It immediately absolved her parents of the abandonment that Holly or her adoptive family might have subconsciously worried about her whole life. The truth was horrific, but it was also a validation of her biological parents' love and their sacrifice.
It established that they died defending her, not discarding her.
Which is so crucial for her psychological integration of this new identity.
Let's discuss that. The intense human impact and the psychological complexity of this reunion. Because for Holly, this isn't just a happy ending, it's a profound identity crisis.
Absolutely. For Dean's mother, Donna Casasanta, and for Tina's siblings, the Lynn family, it was the resurrection of a child they had mourned for 40 years. An unimaginable miracle. It provided closure on the fates of Dean and Tina and this new life in Holly.
But for Holly herself, she now lives with this dual identity. Holly Miller, the person she always knew herself to be, who had a loving upbringing with her adoptive family, versus Holly Clouse, the survivor of a 40-year-old murder and kidnapping.
The emotional labor that requires is just enormous. She has no memory of her biological parents.
Yeah.
She has to reconcile her happy, stable present with the horrific, violent, traumatic truth of her origins.
She has to construct a new historical narrative for herself.
One that involves a cult, a cross-country murder, a decades-long search, all while maintaining the identity and the relationships of the family who raised her. It's an ongoing process of trauma recovery and identity construction. This story is just as much about her psychological journey as it is about the forensic science.
And while the mystery of the Beatty is solved, the murders of Dean and Tina remain an open and active cold case for the Texas Attorney General. So what are the challenges facing investigators trying to prosecute killers after 40 years?
The challenges are immense, and they relate directly back to the cult's initial plan to evade justice in the first place. First, you have deceased suspects. The cult leader, Charles McHugh, Lightning Amen, is known to be dead.
So that removes the central figure.
The one who likely ordered the violence. So investigators have to focus on the peripheral players, the women, Sister Susan and Rosemary Garcia.
And those peripheral players, if they're even still alive, are likely living under completely different identities.
They are. The Christ family's whole nomadic anti-system structure trained them to disappear without a trace. They may be living entirely new lives, completely severed from their cult past, which makes them nearly impossible to locate without a specific current FGG match, which requires a huge amount of luck.
And then there's evidence degradation. That's a huge scientific hurdle.
It's massive. We know DNA identified the victims, but finding viable, traceable DNA of the perpetrator's touch DNA, epithelial cells on those 40-year-old bindings, or the bloodied towel or the remaining clothes, it's a massive scientific challenge. Even modern touch DNA analysis struggles with evidence that's been exposed to the elements or stored for decades.
The evidence is just too old, too fragile.
It's often compromised. And third, you have witness reliability.
Right.
Any surviving members of the Christ family who might have information are now elderly. Memories fade, they may be suffering from cognitive decline, or they may just have forgotten the specifics of events that happened 4 decades ago. And they may be reluctant to betray the code of silence they held for so long.
So persistence is required, but the leads are just so old.
The physical evidence leads are decades old, and the human leads are sparse and aging.
Finally, we have to acknowledge the immediate, tangible legacy of this case, which is Genealogy for Justice.
This is perhaps the most profound outcome. It's a nonprofit organization established by the Clouse and Lynn families alongside the genealogist Alison Peacock, and it builds directly on the momentum of the Hope for Holly project.
And what exactly is their mission?
Their mission is to raise funds to cover the significant cost of DNA testing in FGG for other John and Jane Does across the country. They exist to close that funding gap. The reason so many bodies languish in morgues is simply a lack of municipal budget for this kind of advanced genealogy.
So the Clouse family's tragedy is now directly funding the resolution of countless other cold cases.
It is. The effort has already seen success. They cite the identification of Virginia Higgins Ray in 2023, who was identified because of the funding model created by the Clouse case's success. It turned a personal tragedy into a catalyst for systemic change.
We've reached the conclusion of this deep dive, tracing the Clouse family from a transient ambition in 1980 to a forensic miracle in 2022. Can you synthesize for us the systemic lessons learned here?
I think the story of Dean and Tina Clouse is a masterclass in systemic failure contrasted with technological redemption. The system failed them at every possible juncture in the 1980s. Law enforcement dismissed their disappearance as a benign lifestyle choice.
Which kept them out of the NCIC database.
Exactly. That ensured their details never entered that critical missing persons database. Bureaucracy and these jurisdictional silos rendered them anonymous and untraceable for 40 years. They were erased by administrative chaos, not simply by the passage of time.
But the breakthrough of forensic genetic genealogy gave them back their identity, and, crucially, it gave Holly back her truth.
It did. The FGG process, leveraging consumer DNA databases and sophisticated genealogical research, proves this powerful new reality. Anonymity is no longer permanent, even after 4 decades. The technology is now the most powerful tool we have for restoring names to the nameless dead and providing relief to families who have endured decades of unresolved mourning.
It forces law enforcement agencies to integrate these public resources.
It forces them to integrate public genealogical resources into standard cold case protocols. It has to be part of the toolkit now.
So what does this all mean? The search for the killers, the women of the Christ family who were shielded by their cult's nomadic anti-system structure, that search continues. And while science can identify the victim and technology can give back names, only human persistence and tenacity, tracking those aged, faded leads, can catch the killer.
And I think the greatest lesson of the Clouse case may be that technology needs tenacity to deliver true justice. For you, the listener, you can reflect on the profound vulnerability of transient communities today. People chasing work without deep local roots, who still rely on the fragile connections of community.
It's still a relevant issue.
Very much so. The cult structure provided the cover for their murder, but it was the family's simple, desperate question, what about his wife and daughter, that led to the ultimate necessary conclusion. We must always remember that the human context, the love and persistence of the families, is what powers the science toward justice.
A truly haunting yet ultimately hopeful story of identity reclaimed and persistence rewarded. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.